The clock of life is wound but once, and no one has the power to tell just when the hand will stop at late or early hour. Now is the time we have. Live, love, work with a will. Don't wait until tomorrow, for the clock may then be still. One of the greatest events in all of human life is a wedding. And actually, there's nothing like a wedding ceremony in New York City on Fifth Avenue. I had the privilege of serving as pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church for over 12 years, and I love performing weddings on Fifth Avenue. And one of my most favorite weddings and most memorable weddings was a wedding I performed for Kathy and Jim, she was a particularly gorgeous bride, and he was a particularly handsome groom, and everything was perfect about the wedding. They'd thought everything through. But the one thing they hadn't thought about, their wedding was scheduled for St. Patrick's Day on Fifth Avenue in New York City. They hadn't calculated that the St. Patrick's Day parade was going to go right down Fifth Avenue during the time of the wedding. Well, they were all worried about how they get it, and I said, I'll try to solve this problem. So I went out early the day of the wedding, and with my robe on and my stole on, as if I was ready to do the wedding, and I was trying to see if I could get some help from the police to get the bride and the bridesmaids and the parents and the ring bearer and the flower girl from the St. Regis Hotel right across from our church, across Fifth Avenue during the St. Patrick's Day parade. So I went out, and as I walked out in my robe and my stole into Fifth Avenue, Captain O'Malley, the Irish police officer in charge of the parade, came running over to me and said, "What can we do for you, Father?" And I said, well, I didn't want to tell him my name was Tom Tewell for fear he'd call me Father O'Toole. So I said, I would like a little help. I've got a bride getting dressed right now at the St. Regis Hotel. Is there any way we could get the bride across the street? Is there any way we can do that? How could you help me figure this out? He said, don't give it another thought, Father. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it for you. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we're going to stop the parade. I said, you'll stop the parade? He said, oh, yes, Father. This is New York City. The show must go on, you know. I said, well, I appreciate that, but how are you going to do it? He said, after you meet with the bride, I want you just to raise your hand when she's ready to come across. I will stop the parade. We'll stop all the floats and the bands, and she'll be able to walk right across. It was unbelievable. I went over and told the bride, and she was, of course, thrilled about this news. And I had a prayer with her and her parents and the bridesmaids before we left the St. Regis Hotel. And we got to the place we were going to go out, and I raised my hand, and Captain O'Malley saw me. He gave me a nod. He blew his whistle. The float stopped. The band stopped. The parade stopped. And the bride and the bridesmaids and the ring bearer and the flower girl and her parents walked right across Fifth Avenue during the St. Patrick's Day parade. It was like the parting of the Red Sea. I felt like Moses and the Ten Commandments, you know. It stopped the parade. But as the bridesmaids and the bride went across Fifth Avenue, little girls were so enamored of this beautiful bride, they kept running over to her and having their photos taken with the bride. And then a group of guys who probably had much too much Irish whiskey or much too much Irish beer, they took one like at this beautiful bride and the bridesmaids, and they said, don't do it, don't do it. It was a wonderful event, and the father of the bride was so pumped up by the crowd, this adulation, everybody cheering and yelling for him and for his daughter, and he was just pumped up. And so when we got into the church, he said, now when we get down the aisle, I'm going to say, who gives Kathy to be married to Jim? And you say, her mother and I do. He said, Tom, don't worry about this. Wedding's going to be a piece of cake. Look, they adore us. They adore us in New York City. I said, I know, but you still got to concentrate. Who gives Kathy to be married to Jim? You say, her mother and I do. It's all you got to do. Give her a kiss, hand her over to Jim, go back and sit with your wife. So we get to the part in the ceremony, and I say, who gives Kathy to be married to Jim? And the father of the bride says, my mother and I do. Needless to say, it was a little icy in the first pew when he got back there. But then Kathy and Jim went out onto Fifth Avenue, and they greeted their guests, and as the bands came down Fifth Avenue, they serenaded them with New York, New York, and all these love songs, and it was spectacular. And the tubas would bow over, and the trumpets and trombones would all bow to them, and the majorettes would all salute the bride and groom, and the joy on Fifth Avenue that day was palpable. There's nothing like a wedding in New York City. Now listen. When Jesus of Nazareth tried to describe what the kingdom of heaven is like, what metaphor did he choose to describe heaven? He chose a wedding. And not just a wedding, he chose a wedding banquet. But then when he chose the wedding banquet, there's some curious customs about a first century wedding that we don't have today. For example, in the first century wedding, there was always an element of surprise. And here was the surprise. Nobody knew the exact time of the wedding except the bridegroom. Nobody knew the hour or the minute. I mean, they knew the day, and they knew it would be in the evening, but they didn't have any idea whether it would be 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. They didn't know the exact moment or the hour. They knew the day, but they just didn't know the approximate time. And actually, the groom thought this was going to be so exciting to be able to surprise the bride and catch her napping. And what a joy that would be if the bridegroom got there and the bride wasn't ready. He thought this would be a big joke. I can see from the faces of the women in the congregation today, you don't think this is such a good idea, really. But they did in the first century. They thought this added anticipation and fun and joy to the wedding, that the groom could catch the bride napping on the day of the wedding. They thought it would be a riot. Now, this explains the vats of oil and the 5 foolish bridesmaids and the 5 wise bridesmaids in the story. The 5 wise bridesmaids know the wedding is coming that night, so they get their lamps, they get oil for their lamps, because there was going to be a march around the city. After the wedding ceremony, there's usually going to be taking 1 lap or 2 laps around the village, wherever it was, and everybody would line up and they would cheer for the bride and groom and the bridesmaids, and everybody would cheer. Then they'd go into the wedding reception and the door would be shut. The wise bridesmaids bring their oil because they don't know the exact time of the wedding, and so they think, I better be ready, because I don't know if it's going to be 6 o'clock or 6:30 or 7. I'm not sure what it's going to be. But the foolish bridesmaids thought, oh, we've got time. Let's not worry about it, because, when the bridegroom's going to send the herald a few minutes ahead, or maybe an hour ahead, and say, behold the bridegroom. So we're going to have time then to get some oil. We don't have to worry about it. Let's eat, drink, and be merry now, because, later on, we're going to have time. Well, then, in the parable, of course, Jesus tells, the bridegroom comes, the herald comes out and says, behold the bridegroom, and the bridesmaids and the bride aren't ready. And the foolish bridesmaids panic and say, we wish we could get some of this oil that the wise bridesmaids have. Would you give us some of your oil? And they say, no, we don't know how much oil we're going to need. Because, they may take 1 lap around the village or 2 laps or 3 laps. We don't know how it's going to be. So we need all that oil for ourselves. There's not going to be enough for us and for you. You better go into the town and go to the vendors and buy the oil for yourselves. And so they do go in and buy the oil for themselves. But when they get back and get changed for the wedding and get ready, the door of the reception is shut and they were left out. Now, what in the world is the point of this curious parable? I think the point Jesus is making is you can't borrow somebody else's faith. Now, many people ask me when they study this parable, why is it that the wise bridesmaids didn't share their oil with the foolish bridesmaids? That would have been a great solution. Just give them some of theirs. Everybody would have had enough. But see, that's just the point. Jesus is making a deeper point here. You've got to be ready. You don't know the day or the hour. But also, the most important things in life, isn't this true? Can't be borrowed from somebody. You cannot borrow somebody else's character. You can't borrow integrity. You can't borrow a love of family. You can't borrow somebody's work ethic. You can't borrow somebody else's courage or resiliency. You can't borrow these qualities, and you can't borrow someone else's faith. I think Jesus is making that point. So you better be ready, because you don't know whether the bridegroom's going to come at 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, and you better be ready, because there might not be time. The foolish bridesmaid said, there'll be a lot of time. We don't have to worry about it. But you just never know how much time there's going to be. William Gibson wrote a play years ago called A Mass for the Dead. And in that play, he's the protagonist, and he's an atheist. He doesn't believe in God. But his mother does. His mother's a great believer. She's a strong Christian, and she reads the Bible regularly, and she prays, and she knows God. And he sees her relationship with God, but he doesn't believe in God. His mother dies, and at the service, people said so many wonderful things about her character, her integrity, her faith, and the way she lived her life, her contagious joy. So later in the play, he goes to his mother's house after the service is over, and he's got to begin that work that some of us have had to do, haven't we? Of going to the house of a loved one, and you start going through all their their dresses and shirts and suits and handbags and shoes and furniture and figuring out what you're going to do with all this. You're going to keep it or sell it or give it to the Goodwill, or what are you going to do? And as you're going through he's going through all the house trying to figure this out. And he's got ringing in his ears all the good things people said about his mother's faith. So he thinks maybe I need a little of that faith too. So he sits in his mother's favorite chair. He picks up her dog-eared, underlined Bible. And he puts on her spectacles, her glasses. And he tries to see the Bible through her eyes. And then he comes to the realization, you can't borrow somebody else's faith. You can't see faith that somebody else can see. You can't see the God active in the world that somebody else can see. You need it for yourself. You can't borrow somebody else's faith. Because here's the point. We don't know. Many of us are like that bridesmaid, the foolish bridesmaids. We think, I've got time to cultivate a relationship with God. I can do it later. But the problem is we never know when a crisis is going to come our way, and the person we love most in all the world is going to become very, very ill. We don't know when that day is going to come. We don't know when a doctor will diagnose an illness with us. We don't know when a business challenge is going to come. It's the greatest business challenge of our life, and it requires all the stamina and resiliency and courage and strength that we can muster. We don't know when that day is going to come. It may never come exactly, but we know that illnesses will come and death will come, but we don't know the day or the hour, and we're seduced into thinking we've got time. But the truth is, a tragedy or a crisis may come your way today, or a challenge, a big challenge, and do you have the faith to draw on in that moment? You can't borrow somebody else's faith. Do you have the faith? Do I have the faith? Do you know the name Sully Sullenberger? January the 15th, 2009, he was a U.S. Airways pilot that took off from LaGuardia Airport bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. And on the takeoff, as you know, geese came in and hit both of the engines, and they were both debilitated, incapacitated. They couldn't go. And here's Sully Sullenberger, a U.S. Airways captain with 155 passengers and crew on board, and now they're hovering over New York City, and he's not sure what to do. Do I go back to LaGuardia Airport, or do I have the gasoline and the stamina in the plane to fly to Newark? Would that be easier? Or should I go to Teterboro, that little corporate jet airline airport a little bit north? Do I have the ability to get over there? And he's trying to think about all this. Or could I land on the Hudson River? Notice I didn't say crash on the Hudson River. I said land on the Hudson River, because Sullenberger never thought about a crash. He thought about landing on the Hudson River. And so he's thinking through all these options, and he decides that landing on the Hudson River is the best option. You know the story. And he lands, he hovers the plane, goes lower, 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 and they make a smooth landing onto the Hudson River, and the plane skids across the waters. And he tells the flight attendants and the co-pilot that the passengers should brace for impact, and everybody braced for impact. And so when it was skimming across the water, everybody was ready for it, and the plane started to sink a little bit into the water of the Hudson River, and they open the doors, and the people get out. And New York's finest, the airport sends people, and the police send people in tugboats, so little boats over to get the people on the plane, and they all one by one go down the wing of the airplane and get into the boat and rescue boats. And Sully Sullenberger, meanwhile, is going up and down after he stops the plane and everything is set electronically. He goes up and down, making sure that every passenger, every crew member is out of that plane. Nobody's in the restroom, nobody's anywhere on the floor anywhere. He goes through every inch of that space. And then he gets into the lifeboat himself when all 155 are accounted for. But he didn't have an interview. People wanted to interview him. He wouldn't have an interview till he got to the shore and counted himself that all 155 were accounted for. And then he took an interview. The interviewer reporter said, "Captain Sullenberger, how did you do this? It's a miracle." He said, "Well, actually, my co-pilot, Jeff Skiles, he was amazing. Our flight attendants were remarkable. They kept calm, and they gave clear directions to the passengers as to exactly what to do, what we expected of them, and they did it. The people in the tower were amazing. They told me exactly what was ahead of me and what the flight conditions were and all the different flight patterns I had to choose from. And the passengers were great, and the tugboat captains and the police were great in getting the boat over. Everybody, it was really a team effort that saved everybody's life." And the reporter said, yes, Captain Sullenberger, we get all that, and we appreciate your saying that. But actually, you're the captain. This actually boiled down to what you had to decide. And you were the only one who could make the decision where you're going to land, what you're going to do. How did you make a decision like that? He said, well, maybe this will help you figure out what I was up against and how I made the decision. For over 35 years, I've been making regular daily deposits in the bank of education, training, and experience, so that on January the 15th, 2009, I could make a rather large withdrawal. Now let that lean against you a little bit. He made regular daily deposits in the bank of training, education, and experience, so that when the crisis came, it hit, the challenge came, and he didn't know it was coming that day. Nobody said to him in the beginning of the day, hey, Captain Sullenberger, you're going to be hovering over New York City, and there's going to be a crisis. You're not going to have any jet power. You have to figure out what to do. Nobody said that. He had to rely on the bank of all that he trained and experienced, and you can't make withdrawals off of deposits you never made. Does anybody see a sermon in here somewhere? I think what Jesus is getting at is that if you never made deposits in the bank of faith, if you never prayed, never got to know God, never read the Bible, never had any sense of God's presence in your life, when you really need it, I mean, when the person in your life that you love the most is dying, or when you're dying, or when you face a challenge at work that's beyond anything you ever faced before, and if you don't make the right decision, your company could be facing bankruptcy. When you're facing these kind of major issues, if you don't have anything in the bank spiritually to draw on, what kind of decisions are you going to make? How are you going to be able to do it? I've got to tell you, I love being a pastor. And the thing I love the most about being a pastor is I have the privilege of being with people at the very best and the very worst times of their life. I'm there for weddings and baptisms and joyful celebrations of 50 years of marriage or 60 years of marriage, and we do a renewal of the vows. It's a great privilege, but I also have the joyful privilege of being there at the worst times, when there's a divorce, or when there's a death, or when there's a severe illness. I've gone to many a home or many a hospital or many an intensive care unit when somebody had just a few hours or a few days to live. And, you know, whenever I go into that kind of a situation, nobody has ever said to me, you know, Tom, as I think back over my life, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. Nobody ever says that. They always say, oh, I wish I'd gotten to know my wife better. We had 20 years, but I wish we had more. I wish I'd spent more time with her. I wish I'd cherished her more. I've had wives say to me, you know, I wish I'd gotten to know my husband. He was so busy, but I wish I'd gotten to know him, and I wish I'd taken some little trips away with him. And parents have said to me, I wish I'd gotten to know my children or my grandchildren. I never really got to my kids' ball games. I didn't get to many of my grandkids' ball games, but I wish I'd done that. If I had to live my life over again, I wish I'd done that. And then people say, and I wish I'd gotten to know God. I don't really know God. I don't know how to pray. Some people say I don't know how to pray. I don't know how to read the Bible. I don't know where to start. I wish I'd made basically regular daily deposits in the bank of family life and loving the important people in my life and prayer and getting to know God. I wish I'd done that, because there were times when I needed it and I didn't have anything to draw on, and now I need it. I've only got a few hours to live or a few days to live, and sometimes they say, I wish I had something to draw on. There's a Roman Catholic man who had only a few hours to live. The doctor told him 3 months earlier he was in stage 4 of cancer, and actually that he only had 3 months to live. And when he knew he had 3 months, his wife had died and he had no other children but his daughter. He said to his daughter, you know, I don't know how to pray. All those years I went to the Catholic Church, I did the rosary, but I never really understood it. And frankly, I'm here I am in this hospital room with hospice, and I don't know how to pray. And she said, well, Daddy, I'll talk to the priest. And the priest will come over and the priest will teach you how to pray. And he said, oh, I hope he can teach me, but I just don't know where to start. She said, well, Daddy, I'll call the priest. So she called the priest, and the priest came over. And in 1 or 2 sessions, this guy, this Roman Catholic man, loved prayer. He came to love God. He came to actually be a believer in God. And he looked forward to praying. And he told his daughter, he said, you know, the priest made prayer so simple. I wish I'd known this in my growing up years and in the years of my life. It would have helped me enormously in all the challenges I faced, but I didn't have it. But now I've got it, and I'm relying on prayer, and I'm relying on God, and I'm so glad I've got it. Will you thank the priest for me? And the daughter assured her dad she would. And then the day came when the doctor said, you know, this 3 months has gone pretty quickly, and your daddy only has a few days. And the daughter, no other siblings, no, their mom had died, and she said to her boss, you know, I'm really going to spend these last hours with my dad. I hope I can just take this time off. And the boss said, of course, take all the time you need. And she spent day and night for several days with her dad in the room. She slept in the same room. She was with her dad in the middle of the night. She rubbed his cheek, and she told him she loved him. She kissed him on the cheek and on the forehead, and she recalled memories. She read some stories to her dad. He loved to read, and she had a very poignant time. But she was staying with him day and night, and she wasn't eating and wasn't sleeping very much and didn't have very much coffee to keep her going. And so one morning she kind of woke up from a stupor from the sleep and looked at her dad, and she gave him a kiss, and she went out to get a quick breakfast and a quick cup of coffee. She was only gone a few minutes, but when she came back in the room, her father had died. And she went over and made sure he was dead and called the nurses, and they came in and assured her that her father had died. And she gave her dad a kiss again, hugged him, and thanked him for being such a good dad and being there for her. And then she started the work of calling the funeral home and making the arrangements for the body and for the service. And she called the Catholic Church and made the arrangements. And she did all the things you have to do. She got a few bits of clothing out of his room and pictures that she'd put up of grandchildren and so forth. And so she did all that and was collecting everything and said goodbye to the doctors and nurses. And on her way home, she stopped at the Catholic Church to thank the priest. She said, Father, you'll never know what your prayers did for my dad. You'll never know what it meant to my dad that you taught him how to pray. And the priest said, oh, I'm so sorry your father died, but I'm so delighted to hear that he really learned how to pray. She said, oh, not only did he learn how to pray, but it was his lifeblood. It just gave him life. He brought joy to his heart to be able to pray to God. And he said, you know, what I taught your dad was so simple. She said, well, Father, is there any way you could teach it to me to know how to learn to pray? He said, oh, of course, it's so easy. What I told your dad was to imagine Jesus in that chair right there. And she said, I pulled the chair over right by your dad's bed. I said, just remember, think of Jesus is right in that chair, and just talk to him like you talk to a regular human being. Don't use these or thous or religious language. Just tell him what you feel. If you're anxious, if you're afraid, if you're joyful, whatever you're feeling, if you're scared to death, tell him what you're feeling, and he'll be there for you. And Jesus will be there. He'll give you comfort. He'll give you strength. He'll give you joy. You talk to him just like you're talking to me in the chair. And the priest said, your father seemed to love that. It seemed to be so easy for him. But as soon as the priest said that, the daughter burst into tears. The priest said, oh, did I say the wrong thing? The daughter said, no, you said the right thing, but you just explained a mystery that I've been wondering about, noodling on ever since my father died. It was a mystery to me, and now I understand it. And the priest said, well, what's the mystery? And the daughter said, well, it was the most curious thing. I went out for coffee and a quick breakfast, and when I came back into the room, my father's torso and body were lying in the bed, but he had leaned way over toward the chair. His body and torso were in the bed, but actually his head was in the chair. Oh, my dear Rhode Island friends, the clock of life is wound but once, and no one has the power to tell just when the hand will stop at late or early hour. Now is the time we have. Live, love, work with a will. Don't wait until tomorrow, for the clock may then be still.